So in today's video, we're going to paint a simple watercolor sunflower. This time the watercolor effect is coming from the Fabriano texture. I think it really suits this project, and I'll make sure to link it in the description below. I'm going to start by painting the petals first, and for that I'm going to use the sharp round brush and a pretty bright yellow color like that. And at the largest size for this brush, I'm going to do a stroke-based flower petal. So that means I'm going to start with very light pressure, press harder, and then as I go down, I'll taper it off again by lightening the pressure. Then after that, I'm going to go over it again and just darken the bottom a little bit, and then add some very, very light line details. Again, using the same brush, I'm just holding it very lightly. And I'm going to go through and paint 4 petals exactly like this. And I painted all 4 petals in this kind of a cross shape. Next, I want to slightly adjust the tone and color of each petal so they're not all the same color. And for that, I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand, and I'll just circle each petal one at a time and adjust the hue, saturation, and brightness. And the flower petals here, they definitely aren't done, but just for now, I'm going to put them aside and focus on the center of the sunflower. And that's going to be on its own layer, so I'll make a new layer above the petals. And I'm going to use a pretty saturated brown color like this. And using the same brush I used before, the sharp round, I'm just going to fill out the center of this flower just by dotting various shades of this dark brown. And I think the center of the flower is pretty simple. I guess the key thing about it is that the middle of it here is dark, then it has a lighter band, then the outer edge is dark and very, very lumpy. And if you want, you can change to the water blender brush, and maybe around 10 or 15%, you can carefully mix up a couple areas of this just to make it look like the colors are bleeding a little bit. Next, I'm going to go back to the flower petal layer, and we're going to continue that. And what I want to do is actually make a duplicate of it. Then I can use the arrow tool and just rotate that duplicate layer around and kind of position it halfway in between. If it doesn't quite line up perfectly, you can actually just change to the warp tool and kind of push it and bend it, and try to make this as even as possible. There we go. And obviously we've got 2 layers now for the flower petals, so I'm going to pinch those together. And again, I'm going to duplicate that layer, use the arrow tool, change it back to uniform, and then I can rotate it to kind of fit in the in-between space. Now this looks pretty good, and that could be enough petals, but I want to add a few in these in-between spaces. And for that, I'm actually going to make a new layer and just paint them in by hand. So again, I'm going to use the sharp round brush and a saturated yellow tone, and I'll just do a couple of freehand petals in between. There we go. And then here are the petals I just painted. I actually want them to be below the petals that we copied. So these are going to be the ones furthest in the back of the flower. And then all 3 layers I'll merge together. Next, I'm going to change back to the water blender brush, and I'm going to blend all these flower petals. So basically where they meet, I'm going to try to soften those boundaries, but then in a couple of places I'll leave some hard edges. And after that, I'm going to try to bring out a little bit of detail by adding an outline. So that's going to be on its own layer above the flower petals, and the outline is going to be actually a pretty saturated orange tone like that. For the brush, I'm going to use the fine liner pen and just carefully go in there and add a line on not every single flower petal, but most of them. I'll add line details like this. And after that, I'm going to change the transparency mode of these outlines to multiply, lower it to 0, and slowly raise it back up just until that detail is subtly visible. There we go. And again, just to keep it simple, I'm going to merge those together with the flower petals. Now this one is almost done. I just want to make an adjustment to the flower center. I think it should be a little bit larger, so I'm going to use the arrow tool to stretch it out. And I'm also going to use the warp tool to make it a little bit more round. There we go. And I'm also going to use the water blender and carefully blend the edges of this, not everywhere, but just in a couple of places, so it looks like the colors are bleeding into the flower petals. And at this point, the flower could be totally done, but I want to show you how to do some shading to make this really pop out. So for that, everything needs to be merged together onto one layer. And basically, if the sunlight is coming from this angle, it makes sense that there's a little bit of a highlight here, and then a little bit of a highlight on these inner petals. And to do that, I'm going to use the freehand selection tool and just select both of those areas. And I'll feather them out quite a bit. Then I can go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten those areas and maybe desaturate them a tiny bit. And for the shadows, we're going to do a similar process, but we're basically in the opposite areas as the highlights. So in this case, the shadow is going to be along there, and then on the very tips of these bottom petals. Now, when I darken these, I'm actually just going to darken it a tiny bit. To make a yellow color look darker, it's usually better to add a little bit of orange in there and maybe desaturate it a little bit. There we go. And it's a pretty subtle thing, but I think shading it like this can really improve the three-dimensionality of it. And I actually almost forgot this step here. I want to add some black dots kind of around the perimeter of the center. So for that, I'm going to select a dark color like that. Then using the fine liner pen, I'm just going to carefully dot it around the edge. And there we go. This simple sunflower illustration is all done. And here's the final result. And that pretty much wraps it up. As always, if you think I've earned it, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again for all your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.